Today is Columbus Day in the United States and Thanksgiving Day in Canada. Meanwhile, the Marxists are promoting their false narrative about the Christendoms of the Americas. So today we celebrate our second annual Thanksgiving for Columbus Day. Jesus is King. Welcome to the OnePeterFive podcast, Rebuilding Christendom, Restoring Catholic Culture and Tradition. I am Timothy Flanders, the editor-in-chief of OnePeterFive, and I'm joined today by numerous guests. We have Luis Medina, representing Mexico, Charles Coulombe, French Canada, John Machado from Brazil, Kennedy Hall, you all know him, the Anglo-Canadian, Italian, SSPX partial communion respecter, and also Adrian Alvarado, who's currently in Mexico, but he hails from Venezuela, grew up in Puerto Rico, and he's now a Floridian. So, gentlemen, happy Thanksgiving for Columbus Day, everybody. We're so happy that you're here. This is a wonderful tradition, and I want to we're going to toast Columbus. We're going to talk about Columbus. We're talking about the Christendoms of the Americas. And I want to go to Charles Coulombe first to get your thoughts about everything. Before I do, I want to remind everyone to donate to One Peter Five. Help us do this. OnePeterFive.com/donate. So, Charles, what is so great about Columbus, and what should we appreciate today about the true reality of our history in these Americas?
Well, I prepared a 40-page ode to Columbus in blank verse. I mislaid it, though, so I won't be able to read it. Seriously, Columbus, although Leif Erikson and various other people came here from Europe first, Columbus was the man with whom the story really starts. He was the man who really got the great adventure of Europe in America going, of Christendom in America going. And I have to put it in those terms because at the time that Columbus first came to America, Christendom and Europe were synonymous. The faith was Europe, and Europe was the faith. There was no Protestant revolt. They'd had other problems, but not that. The other thing that's important to bear in mind was that Columbus very much saw his mission to be one of expanding the faith into hitherto unknown regions. He also saw it as a means, in a sense, of rekindling the Crusades. And that sounds a bit odd, but that was very much on people's minds. So much so, not just with Columbus, but with the Spanish in general, that when they finally got all the way up to southern Arizona, the Pimeria Alta, as it was called, they called that section the northern rim of Christendom. And that was an idea that had been in the minds of the Spanish explorers and settlers and missionaries all the way back to Columbus. So what do we owe him? Everything. There was a movement to canonize him back in 1892. And Leo XIII was very much in favor of it. This spurious, and I say spurious because it's found to be a bit of a forgery, annals of Columbus were supposedly his logs and so on. None of it was true. He did the best he could with what he had. He made a deal, if you will, with Our Lady of the Pillar at Zaragoza, which was the first Marian apparition in history, and happened when Our Lady was still alive. It was when St. James, Santiago, was trying to evangelize Spain, having absolutely no luck, and was about ready to throw it in when Our Lady appeared to him on a pillar in Zaragoza, Caesar Augustine, and told him that if he persevered, one day Spain would be a great Catholic country. So he did. Later was martyred, of course. But Our Lady of the Pillar became a very great feast day, October 11th in Spain. So Columbus and his crew having gotten their blessings and so on at an abbey before they left. The crew becomes increasingly restive. He prays very hard to Our Lady for land. And finally, he tells the crew when they're about ready to mutiny, one more day. If we see land on the feast of Our Lady of the Pillar, fine, then we'll land. If we don't, we'll turn around. So, as Providence would have it, they found San Salvador and they landed. And the day we call Columbus Day, which Mondays aside is a fixed day, is actually the feast of Our Lady of the Pillar. So if you celebrate the actual day, you'll be celebrating a Marian feast. And that's important. From the very beginning, Our Lady was present in the evangelization of the Americas. And that too is something we owe Columbus.
Excellent. I'm glad you brought up the Marian element. I want to get back to that because that's in very many ways the most important part, because she is the mother of the Americas and ultimately the Empress of the Americas.
There was one downside, of course, to Columbus's coming here, and that was he got stuck with having the territory that Washington, D.C. is named after him. But he can't be blamed for that.
Yes, certainly a downside.
So, would you really want D.C. named after you? I don't think so.
Certainly not currently. District of Columbia. There's also a country of Columbia. The Knights of Columbus.
Knights of Columbus, yeah.
So thank you, Charles. If anyone wants a cure from their Marxist education, you could pick up a copy of Puritan's Empire by Charles Coulomb. And I just want to summarize real quick, and I want to go to John from Brazil for some comments. Essentially, the false narrative is by taking all of the Indian tribes. There was hundreds and hundreds of different Indian tribes and cultures that spoke different languages and have totally separate civilizations in and of themselves across the Americas. And it's really an anti-Indian narrative because it just summarizes them all as one thing. First of all, they're in some sort of utopian paradise. And then in come the evil Europeans who destroy everything because they're racists, basically. That's essentially the narrative, and that's the more or less the origin of Indigenous Peoples Day. But the reality is that these hundreds of different Indian cultures are totally different from each other. I tell my kids there's good Indians and bad Indians, basically, to make it even generalized, even though that's generalizing too. There's empires who are practicing human sacrifice, and then there's these little tribes like the Huron Indians nearby in Michigan or something who are less peaceful, and yet they're also fighting. Indians are fighting each other. They're enslaving each other. They also have their own racism. The Illinois tribe, for example, they called all the other Indians savages, but they were the real men, for example. And then the Europeans come. They fight each other as well. So it's a big mess. And the only thing that makes any sense out of it is Our Lady. And this is the Christendoms of the Americas. John, tell us a little bit about growing up in Brazil. What kind of history were you given growing up? Tell us a little bit about Brazil.
Right. So I didn't grow up Catholic in Brazil. Now I'm in the U.S. I converted here about 3 years ago. So all that I've learned from Catholicism in the beginning was all American Catholicism. And only recently, the past couple of years, I started going back and trying to find my Catholic roots in Brazil. I was baptized Catholic, but my parents never practiced. Catholicism is so cultural there that most people are baptized Catholic. I never went to Mass. I didn't even learn anything about the Gospels. But recently, I've been trying to, find my roots and learning about the real history of Brazil and the church, because in school, what we learned was completely Marxist. The school I went to, so there's some Jesuit schools in Brazil. Those are kind of popular. I don't know what kind of education they got there. I don't suspect, because I talked to other students who went to those schools, I don't suspect they got anything much different. But I went to a small school I was mainly taught by open socialists. That's just who they were. Brazil has a very big Marxist problem, socialism problem. So I was taught just that the Portuguese came in order to steal all the resources. That was the main thing. It was a financial endeavor, and they enslaved the natives, killed them, fooled them, gave them like mirrors in exchange for like huge amounts of land. They took everything they wanted, and then that's why Brazil is not like a big economic powerhouse. Is because the Portuguese plundered everything. That was the narrative I got. Nothing. The church was mentioned sometimes as like a branch of the Portuguese Empire. Like the church came to erase the culture of the Indians and force our language and tell him lies about religion to control him, make him more docile. That's what I learned. But of course, that's not true. And recently, I learned about, because we don't talk a lot about Columbus in Brazil, because it feels kind of separated from the Hispanic history and the Anglo history. We just learned mostly about Portuguese and Brazilian. So we talk a lot about Pedro Álvares Cabral, who discovered Brazil specifically in 1500. And that story is written down by Pedro Vaz de Caminha. There was a man on the ship who was responsible for writing everything down, and you can still read it today. The first thing they did, so there's a difference, and forgive me if I'm mistaken about this, my Hispanic friends, but from what I've learned, the way the Spanish did it when they found a new land is that the first thing they did was to plant the Spanish flag and declare that the land belonged to the King of Spain. The Portuguese planted the cross first and celebrated a Holy Mass. So they got to Brazil, they planted a big cross, they put an altar, and they celebrated Holy Mass. And the account is that the natives were surprisingly receptive. They were peaceful. They watched it, and there is even an account that a second group of Indians came in and asked one of them, like, "Hey, what's going on?" And the Indian who was already there pointed at the altar and then pointed to the sky. It seemed like they kind of got it. So that's what, before this writer who's writing to the king about the discovery, before he mentions, yes, that's a great painting of the first mass in Brazil. Before he mentions anything economically and resources, he writes to the king, you have to send as many priests as you can to evangelize these people because they seem open to our faith. And that's how Brazil started. And that was, in fact, the case. They sent as many Jesuits as possible, the very good Jesuits back then. And the natives just started converting very easily. And that I feel like is a big difference. Even though we learn in school, I learned that the reason why Brazil isn't doing well is because we were exploited by Portugal, and the U.S. was populated by England. That the English treated the U.S. a lot better than the Portuguese did Brazil, and that's why. But in reality, it seems to me that Brazil just had a very holy beginning with the intent of converting the natives to Catholicism, and successfully, while America, I mean, I don't know as much, but it doesn't sound like that's the case. So it's very encouraging to hear about this origin. And as far as like racial mixing and stuff like that, a big difference that our first Brazilians, because we don't consider it's hard to consider the natives Brazilian because they were, as you said, different tribes, all separated in little different, you know, tribes. But the first actual Brazilians were born of a Portuguese man who shipwrecked in Brazil shortly after the discovery in about 1510, to an Indian woman who was renamed Catarina, and he brought her to France to be baptized. They got married, and the first children of Brazil were between this Portuguese man and this Indian woman. The tribe received him very well. He became one of their leaders and evangelized them. And our first parents, our children are mixed race. It's just always how it's been.
Thanks so much, John. Yeah, I was reading about Brazil and how Brazil is a very similar country to the United States in terms of it's 200 million people. The area is very large, just like the United States. But there's 45 to 50% of Brazilians are all of mixed race. And some say that even a majority are, if you go back far enough, there's ancestors that are all mixed in. Whereas in the United States, there is not such a mixing, which is I think a result of Anglo-heretical racial theories and things like that. But I want to go to Kennedy over in Anglo-Canada because the false narrative against Columbus recently wreaked havoc across Canada a few years ago. And there was a recent news about this that, Kennedy, you reported on. I understand that one of the Indian chiefs, they did an excavation of one of these so-called mass graves and they didn't find anybody. What's the latest from Kennedy?
The latest from Kennedy or the latest from Canada? The mass graves thing was a hoax. Imagine that. A bunch of race hustlers made some stuff up to get some money from the government. I know you're shocked and you've never thought you'd ever see something like that in your life. The Pocahontas fantasy that the liberals have about the natives being, Disney characters just isn't true. They all are human beings, which means some of them are nice and some of them not so nice. And the more pagan they are, the less nice they are. And they all suffer from original sin. So when it came time to stick it to the, evil Christian white man who colonized, which has become a dirty word because, of course, we don't want to live in colonies. We want to live, I don't know, in shanty towns or something instead. Colonies are bad. Oh, okay. Yeah. Anyway, so it was a hoax that started in 2021. I've talked about this 100 times in other places, but the short Coles notes are that some researcher who was an Indigenous woman doing some research in the soil on some Indian property found aberrations in the soil, which turned out to be tree roots and rocks. But nonetheless, the narrative was, look at all the bodies. And of course, before they had a chance to actually verify, the accusations of genocide and all this kind of stuff were making the rounds and churches were being burned down in Canada. This was also in the summer of 2021. It was a very difficult time to be a Catholic because most faithful Catholics were also vaccine heretics, which meant they were doubly offensive. They were both genocidal and they wanted to kill your grandma by not getting vaccinated. So the desire to exterminate the Catholic from Canada was very strong for a few months. And in any case, then they just started saying, look at all these unmarked graves. It went from discovering these alleged mass graves as if these reserves were Auschwitz to look at all these graves where they buried the natives 6 feet apart as you would in a cemetery, but then never put a headstone. That turned out to be false. Justin Trudeau was photographed kneeling beside a landscaping flag with a teddy bear. And it turns out where he was kneeling was actually a former community cemetery run by a parish. And since it had been taken over by the reserve, run by the natives who are incapable of sin, they had somehow not replaced the wooden crosses, so they disintegrated over many, many years. He may have been kneeling beside an elderly Catholic white woman who died 110 years ago, for all we know. We literally don't even know who's there. But anyway, so that's the crux of what happened. And recently, they finally did excavation work, because this is the funny thing. And this is just maybe a little side note, but I don't think people realize just how absurd they sound when they talk about indigenous things. Like they'll say things like, well, it's impossible to ever do anything on a native burial ground because burial grounds are sacred to natives. And it's like, what person on earth does not think that a burial ground is sacred? People don't think these things through. All people who bury their loved ones think that where they're buried is sacred. It's not unique to natives. So if you can, dig up a grave in a regular cemetery, a Catholic cemetery, because, I don't know, Al Capone hid some treasure there or something like that, then it's, you can do things like that anywhere if you can do it at all, right? It's not because they're native that it's more sacred. It's just the fact that all places where you bury people are sacred. That's just common sense. And it's amazing what the average Marxist Canadian will do to do apologetics for this native stuff. I was watching this one clip on the CBC. It used to be called the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Now it's called the Communist Broadcasting Corporation. That's what I call it. And these residential schools where allegedly all this stuff happened, which never did. The buildings are obviously, many of them are still around. They were repurposed to public schools, things like that. And there was one thing where there was this, middle-aged, 50-something white woman who works for the CBC, walking through this former residential school, which wasn't even a boarding school, which means it was a day school. Anyway, walking through this elementary school with these two indigenous women wearing dream catchers and stuff like that. I don't even think their tribes ever use dream catchers. I think they've just, whatever. And they said walking through the school, they started saying, oh, we have to tread very lightly here because we still feel the spirits of these children here. And they said, we need to walk very lightly. We have to walk lightly. And the old white woman is like, oh yes, thank you for your wisdom, native woman. I'm so enamored with how wise you are about the spiritual world. I will walk lightly through these hallways. And I thought to myself, if you encountered somebody saying, we need to walk lightly through these hallways because the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ is present, they would say, oh, you're a crazy fundamentalist wacko. I'm never going to take you seriously. But the native women, who didn't even go to the school, by the way, talking about their grandparents that attended there 80 years ago, tell the lady that there's basically ghosts walking around, and because that you have to tiptoe, and regular people accept this as if it's not insane. I don't know what the point of that rant was, but it's over now.
Thank you, the Kennedy Report. Kennedy, appreciate the update from the communist dystopia of Canada. I want to go to Adrian and then Luis. Adrian, any comments from you are the only Caribbean representative here, but you're Venezuelan, so you're the Spanish South American wing. Any comments on Columbus and the Christendoms of the Americas?
Of course, yeah. So I think some people would consider Venezuela part of the Caribbean. It's up to debate whether it's more South American or Caribbean. We don't know, but they do like baseball instead of soccer. So that's kind of a telltale sign. So Columbus is actually kind of an interesting figure because we know, as Charles Colomb alluded to, that he was sent by Queen Isabella of Spain, and she is actually a servant of God. Very interesting. She was also a great figure for acknowledging the humanity of the natives, of the indigenous peoples that were there. A big portion of what people don't realize is that Christopher Columbus, he sailed under the Spanish flag, and so in that way, he was kind of a sort of a Spanish immigrant. He even married a Portuguese woman. It was very interesting. So he kind of became Iberian, even though he's from Genoa. So there we go, a little Hispanization of this Italian explorer. But it's very interesting because the school of Salamanca was instrumental in recognizing this humanity of the native peoples there, and we know that Christopher Columbus, when he sailed to the Caribbean first, he discovered so much there, and he landed in Hispaniola, eventually They would be Puerto Rico, all this kind of thing. On his third voyage there in 1498, very interesting because it was kind of a star-studded event. Everybody and their grandma was there apparently, because that's when he went with Amerigo Vespucci, and they went to the island of Trinidad, of Trinity, right? Trinity, that's what it means, Holy Trinity. And so they went there, and eventually they discovered on August 6th, they discovered Venezuela. There they got to the Orinoco River, which is one of the longest rivers in South America, and they were greeted by the natives, who were pretty receptive, and they were very peaceful, very friendly, and so things generally in that first meeting there didn't go south. And very interesting because another Italian who was there with him, Vespucci, who obviously Amerigo Vespucci is named, America because of him. So the two Americas, Central and then even Central America, even are all named after Amerigo. And then he also he was on a naming spree, I guess, because he goes to Venezuela. He sees these houses built on stilts on top of Lake Maracaibo, and he sees these houses above the water, and he says, "Oh, it kind of reminds me of Venice, so I'm going to call it Little Venice, Little Venezia." So it's going to be Venezuela, and so that's why Venezuela is named that. That's why it has that name. Very interestingly, later on in the 20th century, many parts of South America will celebrate Columbus Day as El Día de la Raza, the day of the race, the day in which the sort of the Hispanic race was born, which is obviously a mixture of many different cultures. It's Spanish, it's African, it's Native. All these different peoples come and they amalgamate and they become a new race, and so that's why that day is called that. However, after the 90s, when in 1992, when the first time that the Indigenous Peoples Day was really kind of celebrated in Berkeley, California. Of course, it was California. Later on, when Venezuela gets its socialist, leftist, communist government with Chavez, he is the first one to officially change the name of El Día de la Raza, which had been in that way since for forever. He changed it to the Indigenous Peoples Day, of course, and then eventually the current president Maduro, who is his acolyte, his crony, he changed it to the Day of Indigenous Resistance and Decolonization. So we're just doubling down, just making it even more. Which again, it really shows this irony, because it was really the school of Salamanca. It was the Queen Isabella who really acknowledged the humanity, the equality under the eyes of God of the indigenous people, which was something that really did not really exist in the Protestant theology, because there wasn't really scholars or academics, theologians who were looking at this with a critical lens. So that's a little bit about Columbus.
The Indians didn't recognize that to each other.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
Equality.
But yeah, that's also pretty cool. So kind of a star-studded discovery there of Venezuela.
Excellent. Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, I want to talk about the Marian element, and I'll go to you, Louise, in a minute. So Columbus is sailing on the Santa Maria de Immaculada Concepcion, Saint Mary of the Immaculate Conception. As Charles said, he finds the Americas on the feast day of Our Lady of the Pillar. Then we have, within the octave of the Immaculate Conception, we have a new massive apparition, Guadalupe, which leads to the conversions of Mexico. And we have the first mass in Spanish Florida is on the feast of the Nativity of the Theotokos, September 8th. And I just found this out recently. I didn't realize that. So the Anglos landed in Maryland, which is the land of Mary, named after the English queen, but also Our Lady. And they landed on the Annunciation. March 25, 1634. And so the Annunciation is always celebrated as Maryland Day. And then the Bishop John Carroll of the United States then consecrated the United States to the Immaculate Conception. And I was recently in DC, speaking of DC, and I found this wonderful mosaic of Our Lady of Guadalupe, really depicted as the Empress of the Americas. As and Luis, I'm going to go to you in a minute, but Luis, you've really emphasized the fact that Our Lady of Guadalupe is not just Mexican, but she's the Empress of the Americas. And this in Washington D.C., the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception really depicts this, because you have all of these different races of people of the Americas all uniting in Our Lady of Guadalupe. And it's really the devil wants to divide people. That's why he creates the Indigenous Day versus this versus that, us and them, and all that. Whereas Our Lady is the one who unites the Americans, all the Americans from North and South, into one. And what's so beautiful is that she appears as this mestiza who is bringing together the two races of Mexico in one. So, Luis, can you speak to what are your comments?
Absolutely. And very interesting story about Our Lady of Guadalupe. Overall, let me preface it like this. First of all, the story of Columbus is a story that should compel us to be grateful. Why? Because none of us, at least on this panel and all the audience, most of the audience at least, we wouldn't be here without Columbus's voyage. We wouldn't be here without Spain financing that first voyage. We wouldn't be here had not the gospel being the main driven force to reach new worlds. The technology, by the way, as a side note, was incredible. Let me put it in comparison to what it compares nowadays. Okay, is back then what Spain and Portugal did, it would be equivalent to the moon race kind of thing. When Russia and America had the technology, everybody else was kind of on the lines and all that. Well, Spain and Portugal did that equivalent back in the day to reach new areas, new lands, literally. But anyway, back to Our Lady. So this is very interesting. Often we're tempted to think of a story of Columbus in the Indigenous Days or Columbus Day, whatever it is, and we are often tempted to follow the narrative to think of it as a supremacy story. We won, you lost, us versus them, as Timothy was pointing out earlier in this commentary. Or it's about bashing Indians, or bashing the whites, or bashing the Europeans, or the Catholics, or the Protestants, whatever, pick your side, right? It's very common, especially now day and age. But that's, in my opinion, humble opinion, a kind of mistake. The story of Columbus really points out to the bigger story. What's the bigger story? It's the story of Our Lady. This is, in my opinion, why the enemies of the faith have attacked that story so heavily. You see it in the narratives in all the school systems, whether it's all the way from Canada, all the way to Argentina. It's the same theme. The Indians were good, all this, the Europeans were bad, or the Catholics were bad, or the Christians in general were bad regardless. So obviously the point here is to distract us, to divide us. Why? Why often when people ask me, why is there so much emphasis on Our Lady and Columbus and all these things, and what's so important about Our Lady? Well, at the risk of stating the obvious, when we pay attention to Columbus' story, we inevitably think of Our Lady. And anybody who truly comes to Our Lady, who goes close to Our Lady will do what she always has done, which is she points people out to her Son. It's simple as that. Just like that's what we see in the gospel, that's what we see in Marian apparitions. At the end of the day, it's always been pointing toward Christ. It happened in Guadalupe, by the way. It happened in all the major Marian apparitions that we know of. And this is why the enemies of the faith, regardless of their stripe, they fear the most. They don't want us to actually look at Our Lady, because Our Lady is going to guide us better than anybody else, by the way, better than you and I or the Pope or whoever is going to guide us to Christ in a most secure, direct way possible. And obviously, anybody who finds Christ has found the treasure of life. That's obviously very clear. So when we look at this story, we can think, at least from my perspective, being born and raised part of my life in Mexico, obviously Guadalupe is just part of our culture. Unfortunately, because it's part of our culture, we take it for granted, right? It's just like, kind of like in America, politically speaking, we take our freedoms for granted. And when they come under assault, we start valuing more now, especially during this times, or even from 3 years ago to nowadays. We see those liberties at risk. Well, the same thing happened for us in Mexico. We took for granted Our Lady. And now religious life in Mexico is at risk. Mexico, sadly, is becoming more paganized. And Adrian can attest that. He's down there in Guadalajara, sadly, which is, by the way, speaking of Mexico, that's the bedrock of Christianity in Mexico, Guadalajara. That's as Christian as it gets, okay? So we are taking it for granted, and unfortunately, Mexico is becoming more pagan as before, aided by this nativist narrative, which is all of you stated clearly, is false, it's not true. And again, we're not here to bash or hate on the indigenous tribes. There were sinful people like we are today, by the way. We all commit our sins and we all have irreparable acts. But at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is manipulate. So we, like I stated before, don't look at Our Lady, so Our Lady can guide us to Christ. That's the theme to me, the most important part of this whole story of Columbus. Anything else is basically, sugar added, to the value of this expedition that Columbus did. Obviously, we stated before in our series of Catholic Spain, Timothy, before a few years back, how this whole process worked. It's an incredible story. I definitely recommend it. Believe it or not, one of my favorite books is Puritan's Empire by Dr. Colom, which I recommend a lot to a lot of people. I wish it can be published in Spanish, I'm not going to lie, because it's a great publication. It tells a lot of that story, by the way, of the Hispanic enterprise. And I can close with this, Timothy, if you allow me. When you think about Hispanic, the word Hispanic, and I mentioned it with you sometimes before, we're often tempted to see it as mere racial terms or even religious terms. Really, it goes beyond that. To be Hispanic, it has three key characteristics. Okay, first one is Catholic. The second one is pro-family. We're very familiar, and the third one is Marian. Okay, you can be Hispanic and speak indigenous tongues, literally. Italian, because southern Italy was part of Spain, the Spanish monarchy. You can speak some Portuguese. You can speak literally some sort of Belgium dialect over there, whatever it is. So it goes beyond race, it goes beyond even culture. It's actually about values of Christianity. That's the theme that characterizes Hispanic. This is why Our Lady is having so much success in America nowadays. You see Our Lady of Guadalupe everywhere in the US because she's not promoting a racial type over the other or even an ideology over another. She's promoting the gospel. And this is what we should be focusing on all the time.
Excellent. Thank you, Luis. I heard that shout out to Spanish Flanders. Thank you.
Thanks.
So, John, I wanted to ask you, I'm going to ask John, and then Charles Colomb needs to have the last word as well. John, can you tell us a little bit of any of the Marian elements of Brazilian culture?
Yes. So in Brazil, I had never heard of Guadalupe there because we have our own, our patron saint of the nation is Our Lady of Aparecida. And that's a story that, real quickly, before I tell that one, just the previous story I had told about the first couple, the first children of Brazil, that Indian woman, Catarina, there was one time she had these series of dreams over about 4 nights of a shipwreck and men in the water, and this woman dressed in white and blue coming out of the water holding a child, and she was completely dry even though she was coming out of the ocean. She asked her husband to go look for these men, this shipwreck. He sent people 4 or 5 days in a row. He couldn't find anything. He said, "Hey, I'm giving up. It's just a dream." But then that night, after he said that, they finally found a group, I think, of 8 Portuguese men who had shipwrecked. And she asked about the lady with the child and said, "No, there's no lady. We're just men." Until later that day, they found a box in the ocean. They swam and got it. When they brought it to shore, it was an image of Our Lady holding our Lord as a child, and the image was, she was dressed in white and blue, and it was completely dry inside a box in the ocean. And that was our first, the first Brazilian couple, the first children. That's how it started. The statue is still there. There's still devotion. So that's just one smaller story. That's not the Aparecida I was telling you about just now, but our main Marian, not apparition, but I don't know how you'd call it, but it happened in 1717. There was a governor. Yeah, there she is. There was a governor who was stopping by this small town in the state of São Paulo, Guaratinguetá. This was a big deal. He was like, at the time of the colonies, he was the governor of a big, like, it's not called a state, but it was a big deal that he was coming by, and they wanted to throw him a party. Um, and I believe it's because it was on a Friday. They needed fish, and the fishermen went out to the river to fish. They prayed to Our Lady to get fish, and they couldn't get anything. They all night they fished. They couldn't get any fish. The governor was coming. They didn't know what to do. They're almost giving up when they cast their nets and found this terracotta statue of Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception without a head. They thought it was strange. They cast again. They got the head, and as soon as they put the head back on the body and made the statue whole, it became so heavy they couldn't lift it anymore. Nobody could do anything with it. And as soon as that happened, they cast the net again. They got so many fish that the boat was about to go under. It was completely miraculous. They got the fish. They had the party, and the statue was kept at someone's house, and people kept going back and praying all night. And there were just a bunch of miracles nonstop after that. As I mentioned, it's terracotta. It survives to this day. It's not, and it was underwater for who knows how long. But this is and the area that it was Aparecida is the name of the area now. So she's Our Lady of Aparecida. So it's not an apparition. It's the miraculous statue. But that's the, even though not being Catholic, that's the only thing I knew about Mary growing up, and that you see everywhere. It's the equivalent of our Guadalupe. You see replicas of that statue everywhere. The cathedral she's in now gets like completely full pilgrims, and it's a huge deal. So that's our Mary, the Brazilian Mary, our patron, and just a little interesting parallel with the first miraculous statue that came over with our first parents, and then our patron with the Aparecida.
Wow, thank you, John. I did not know anything about it. So it's just amazing how Our Lady is always involved giving birth to Christendom, giving birth to all these different Christendoms in these different places of the Americas. So, Charles Coulombe, please, any last final words? We've got about 5 minutes left. You wanted to talk about Isabella. Go ahead. Oh, you're muted, Charles.
Some would say I'm at my best when I'm muted, but never mind.
There we go.
No, the thing is that every country in the Americas has as Our Lady as the patroness one way or the other. Even in our own country, December 8th, Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception is the patroness of the United States. And that's always something we should remember. Our Lady was key to the settling from Hudson's Bay to Tierra del Fuego. But it's also important to remember that Columbus could not have gotten anywhere without Queen Isabella of Spain and her husband, King Ferdinand. Queen Isabel is a candidate for sainthood. She's a venerable, I think. So the beatification was stalled some time ago by non-Catholic pressure, but she's still the cause is still out there. So, I can only recommend very highly that people read about her, find out about her, visit the site of her cause. There are a couple of books, one by Warren Carroll about Queen Isabella, and the other is by William Thomas Walsh. I think it's called Isabella the Last Crusader or something like that. But they both wrote very good books on Queen Isabel. William Thomas Walsh incidentally also wrote some really good books on Philip II and Characters of the Inquisition, which is a great antidote to the Black Legend of Spain. The other thing to bear in mind when all of this comes up and people start yapping about Columbus and wasn't it terrible, so on, so on, so on. Everything we have, everything the medium we're speaking on right now came to us because of that discovery. We're speaking in a European language right now. It would be true if we were speaking Spanish or French. Very few people speak indigenous languages in the Americas. Our technology, our clothing, our food, everything we have, literally, especially, most especially, our faith, came to us thanks to Columbus and the other colonizers and the monarchs who backed them. They're our founding fathers, really, more than the crew at Philadelphia. You see, the American adventure did not begin in 1776. It didn't begin with Plymouth Rock in 1619. It did not begin with Jamestown in 1607. Hard to believe it didn't begin with Quebec in 1608. I know, it's very hard for anyone to believe that, but it's true. It didn't. It didn't even begin with St. Augustine, Florida in 1567. I know. It began with Columbus's arrival in 1492. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And that's the irreducible fact. And my final word on it, to anyone who yaps about empire and colonialism and decolonizing literature and dealing with structures of power in the intersectionality and blah, blah, blah. All right, fine. To really be honest, not to be hypocritical, what you need to do is get rid of everything European, stop speaking a European language, stop wearing European clothing, stop eating European food, sit in the mud and eat grubs. If you don't do that, if you dare to open your mouth about those things and you do so using a European language and a European medium, like, I don't know, the one we've got, then you're a hypocrite and a liar. I mean that in a nice way, of course. As a Californian, I'm incapable of meaning anything except nicely. Look at Governor Newsom if you don't believe me.
There we go. Thank you, Charles Coulomb. Perfect ending to our Columbus Day celebration. So here's to Columbus. Thank you, Columbus, for bringing the gospel here.
Yeah.
And let's offer it all to Our Lady. Kennedy, can you pray the second half of this?
Sure. Yep.
All right. Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Jesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Our Lady of Guadalupe, Empress of the Americas.
Pray for us.
Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.